What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. Before I introduce today's guest, I have a couple of quick announcements. Number one, given the war in Ukraine and given the larger geopolitical conflict between Russia and the US and Europe, I've decided that I'll be recording and publishing more than one episode a week going forward, with the immediate goal of updating much of the coverage we'd already done in anticipation of this conflict in order to bring you all up to speed on the latest developments, and with the larger, more long-term goal of helping you all wrap your arms around some of the more nuanced aspects of this geopolitical crisis, so that you know what to focus on, who to listen to, and how to think about the types of risks that all of us face going forward. That's number one. Number two, because the focus is going to be on getting episodes scheduled, recorded, and published sooner rather than later, the intelligence reports and transcripts for these episodes will either lag the publication of the episode itself, or we may just focus on giving you more of the things that are most important within these reports, like links to educational resources so you can dig deeper, articles that I've been reading in preparation for these episodes, as well as lists of people to follow in order to stay up to speed and, more importantly, in the loop on what is most important to focus on. Now, moving on to today's episode and to my guest, Dmitry Alperovitch. Dmitry is the former CTO and co-founder of CrowdStrike, the largest cybersecurity company in the world, and the current chairman of the nonprofit Silverado Policy Accelerator. He was on the podcast a little over 2 months ago for a discussion about why he was convinced in late last year that Vladimir Putin had every intention to invade Ukraine in January or February of this year. It was a very controversial view at the time, but unfortunately, he proved to be absolutely correct in his assessment. So I wanted to have him back on the show today to understand not only why so many people struggled to see this war coming, but also to get his insights on all the ramifications of Putin's actions since our last conversation, including an understanding of Putin's motivations, strategic or otherwise, risks of escalation, pathways for de-escalation, the mood in Beijing and implications for U.S.-Sino relations and negotiations over Taiwan, the remilitarization of Germany, and the strategic security of Europe, and so much more. This was a really powerful conversation, and I cannot possibly recommend it enough. As is often the case, the second parts of my conversations with guests are available to premium subscribers only. All subscribers gain immediate access to our premium feed, which will allow you to listen to the entire podcast, including the second part, just like you listen to it on the public feed, which means you'll be able to use applications like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., and have every episode downloaded directly and automatically to your phone whenever a new episode publishes. So without any further ado, I bring you my conversation with Dmitry Alperovitch. So Dmitry, welcome back, first of all.
Thank you.
Under very non-ideal circumstances, let's say. The last time you were on the podcast, I had actually asked you to come on because you had published a thread. I think the thread was published on December 21st, and it was a more coherent articulation of certain points that you had already begun to voice, not just in private, but actually in public on Twitter in the days prior. And what I remember you essentially saying was that you were of the view, based on a number of signals, and you laid those out, and we discussed them in our conversation, that Putin had already made the decision to invade Ukraine, that this was a long time coming, and that there was very little the United States and Europe could do about it. You turned out to be correct. And actually, you turned out to be correct, I think, even more strongly than perhaps even you or certainly I would have expected, which is that the hope was that this was going to be an incursion, but not necessarily a full-on attack of the entire country and an attempt to take it over. Maybe, in fact,
I thought
was
so.
your...
I thought he was going to take Kiev. I thought he was going to take everything to the east. of Ukraine, which is certainly what they're doing right now. They may end up taking the West as well. We'll see. But everything that they're doing, I thought they would do.
Okay, so I stand corrected. I was hoping that they weren't going to try to take the entire country, and in fact, they did. And so here we are. And I'm curious before we get, and I'm not particularly interested in doing too much of a retrospective, though I think it's important to kind of ask at least one or maybe a few questions about this. And the first question is, looking back on your prediction in December, first of all, it was extremely controversial for the time. There weren't a lot of other people making that prediction. You were the first I'd seen. Certainly to make it so strong with so much conviction. Even the president of Ukraine was blindsided by this invasion. From what public statements, it appeared to me that he only began to believe that it was going to happen a week or so. And I'm just working off of sort of memory here, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. So many other people didn't see this, experts, etc. What do you think explains why you were right and so many other people were wrong on this one?
I think a lot of people assumed that this would be a tremendously difficult endeavor, that the Russians could never pull it off. And as a result, it would be foolish to start. And they're certainly encountering problems, but, it's a week in, more than a week in, and they've already taken huge swaths of the country. They're very close to surrounding Kiev. So the progress that they've made, I think a lot of people are downplaying right now because they want to encourage the Ukrainians and they want to talk up the really valiant, incredibly courageous defense that the Ukrainians are putting up. But they're steadily but surely making progress, and they're going to decimate their way towards occupation. I have no doubt about this. I believe that was very likely to happen back in December when I became convinced that he was going to do it. So a lot of people just couldn't imagine this scenario. They couldn't believe that he could pull it off. And I think they were deluding themselves, which right now I think is pushing people into the other side of the spectrum by saying, well, he was insane to start this. We didn't think that he was insane. So he must be mad enough to launch nuclear weapons, which I completely disagree with, but that's for another time.
Wow, there's so many things I want to ask you right there. First of all, I just want to try to tie this off a little bit. What do you think accounts for the difference in your view, in your prediction, in your estimation back in December versus those of other experts who clearly are intelligent, they study the subject. So, I'm just curious, what do you think accounts for that distinction?
Look, I just think a lot of people can't imagine the status quo breaking. They didn't think that, you could stage an invasion force that would take over a massive country like Ukraine in this day and age. I was not just reading the political signals, but I was paying very, very close attention to the military signals, as were a few others, by the way. I wasn't the only one. I have to give credit to Michael Kaufman, a phenomenal military strategist at the Center for Naval Analysis, Rob Lee, another great military analyst in Russia. We were all looking at the TikTok data and the other videos that were being posted of the amassing of the largest invasion force Europe has seen in over 50 years. And when those things occur, they sort of take on a life of their own. Remember 2003 in Iraq, March of 2003, when we had assembled a massive invasion force in Kuwait to go into Iraq. There was really zero chance that Bush at that point was going to pull back and say, you know what, Saddam Hussein allowed inspectors in, so I'm not going to invade. Like once you've moved all those troops, all those logistics, all those weapon systems into place, once you're, literally an order away from launching an invasion, it becomes very, very difficult to pull back and, admit sort of the political defeat that would come with a concession like that and bring all those troops home. So I just didn't think it was going to happen. And I was also looking at the reasons for why he would do this. And it was very clear to me that he was trying to adjust for the failures that he has had in the last 8 years that had driven Ukraine into the arms of the West, into the arms of NATO, and that he was desperately focused on correcting that.
Do you think that people have the wrong idea of what his motivations are and view him to be irrational when in fact he's simply operating with a different set of rational objectives? That, in other words, that he's acting rationally, he just has a different set of core values.
Absolutely. He is acting like a 20th century great power guy that is trying to accumulate spheres of influence. And there are a lot of people in this town in DC and many capitals in Europe that think that era is long gone, that, we're living this new era where we're just going to resolve our differences through diplomatic engagement. And that's just not the case. Military power, the power of the strong, has always ruled geopolitics from the time of the dawn of the civilization. It will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And there's so many people that thought that the end of history has come post the Cold War era, famously in the words of Fukuyama, and that we were in this new world where the use of military power like this, at least in Europe, was unimaginable.
Yeah, well, I mean, to that point, one of the things I do want to discuss with you later in this conversation is the implications of Russia's invasion and the fallout from this crisis for the evolving nature of the world order. Because I think there's a lot of really interesting aspects to that to discuss, including China. But you mentioned Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee. I follow both of them. And it would seem, based on what I've read of their work, and both their articles and their tweets over the course of many weeks, is that they seem to think, based on what you just said, that the situation for Putin on the ground and for the Russian military is perhaps worse than what you have described here. And while, for example, Michael has not offered a conclusive opinion on it, he remains baffled. And a lot of people remain baffled as to the execution of this campaign. Would you say that you differ between those two? And so tell me then, what is the kind of alignment there? What is the view that you guys share?
No, I have enormous respect for Mike and for Rob. I talk to them frequently. I think our views are very, very similar. The reality is that we were all sort of baffled by the initial invasion plan. We did not think that they were going to be as dumb as to think that the Ukrainian forces would just dissipate, that they could drive into Kiev literally with a company of armored vehicles and just take Zelensky and declare victory. That appears to be what they thought, or at least Putin had thought in the initial sort of 3 days when they were doing these lightning strikes with small units. They weren't fighting as battalion tactical groups with combined armor. They weren't using their air power resources. It was just a really, really puzzling attempt to take the country on the cheap, thinking that there was not going to be any resistance. That was sort of phase one and lasted about 3, maybe 4 days. And then they regrouped and they realized, well, that's not working. We've suffered pretty heavy losses trying this stuff. Now let's go back to the traditional way we fight, which is use lots of artillery. Let's bring in tactical aviation to start bombing military targets and start actually doing a lot of devastations to cities as well. Let's not do these suicide raids into cities anymore. Let's bring in massive armor to start surrounding Kiev and some of these other places. And that's what they've been doing. So now that they kind of went back to the plan that we all expected them to do on day one, they're starting to achieve a lot of objectives. In the South in particular, they've made enormous amount of progress. They've taken virtually the entire area that has been called the bridge to Crimea, connecting the Donbass in the southwest with Crimea. The only thing that's standing in that place is the city of Mariupol, which has been now completely surrounded, is under heavy bombardment as we speak right now, that they'll probably take through sheer force in the coming days. They've pushed north very far to Zaporozhye. So there were reports last night and videos of the bombing of the nuclear power plant station near Zaporozhye. No damage done to the nuclear power plant, thankfully, but that shows you how far they've gone in the northern direction. In the eastern direction in the south, they've taken Kherson, which is a fairly large city in the south. They're pushing further. They're now near Mykolaiv, which opens up the road to Odessa. That is part of their objectives as well. And even in the north, where they've run into some difficulties, you've seen them really get pretty far in the west very quickly, within about 3 or 4 days, reaching the suburbs of Kiev by going through Pripyat and Chernobyl and rushing towards Kiev. In the west, in the northern part, they've really struggled quite a bit to get from Sumy and Kharkiv down to Kiev. They got bogged down into some pretty significant firefights, but it looks like they're now within about 30 miles of Kiev from the western side as well. So they're probably within days of being able to surround Kiev. And then we're in for a long haul of just a devastating campaign that will be very brutal and will probably leave Kiev, unfortunately, in ruins. So, to summarize, yes, everyone was kind of baffled by their initial plan because it was based on these really crazy assumptions. But once they realized it was no longer working, they reverted back to doctrine. They reverted back to what you expect Russians to do. And now it's sort of proceeding more or less according to plan. I will add one more thing. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about why has it gone fairly badly for them. I would give them a grade of C overall for how they've executed this operation. And even to this day, they haven't shut off Ukrainian Air Force. They haven't really destroyed almost any runways, which is really remarkable. So the Ukrainians are still flying. They haven't really done a good job of shutting down their air defense. So they're still able to shoot down some of the Su-25 attack aircraft that the Russians are using for close air support. And they haven't used virtually any electronic warfare except on a very limited scale within the country. They haven't used any cyber or much of any cyber. So just a lot of things that they haven't done, even though they certainly have the capability to do so. And thinking about why that may be, I realized that one of the problems that they've had is Putin's paranoia and Putin's secrecy. And I think we actually, the United States, impacted that quite a bit by disclosing the intelligence in the lead up to the war for 2 months. There have been these releases about what the Russians are planning, how they're planning it, the pretexts that they were going to create for this invasion, the false flag operations, which in the end not only dissuaded them from doing any of that because we sort of outed it before they could execute it, but also I think made Putin so paranoid that he dramatically limited the number of people, even in the Russian military, that he had told that he was going to invade, which ended up being a serious mistake because you can't plan a war with a few dozen people. You have to let the commanders on the ground know and prepare for it. You have to make sure they have the right training, the right logistics and everything else. And I think a lot of the problems that they're encountering right now is because of that secrecy.
Do you think that the role of the Biden administration and the way in which they ran interference on the part of Putin's plans and the information warfare that I think he has been accustomed to being able to sort of dominate in, that's underappreciated, both for not just what you described in terms of causing him to get off center, but also in laying the groundwork so that when the invasion actually did happen, the Western allies, the Europe and the United States, were really already in sync and were able to mobilize a counteroffensive pretty rapidly?
No, I think it was quite brilliant strategy. And make no mistake, it is a huge shift for the U.S. intelligence community to decide to declassify very sensitive intelligence about a hard intelligence target like Russia. A lot of inertia inside many intelligence community buildings to do the exact opposite. And the fact that they pushed them nevertheless to do it and have declassified lots of information about exactly what Putin was planning to do is really remarkable. And I think achieved a number of tactical objectives, such as getting the Russian military to be off kilter and not be fully aware of what Putin has been planning by instituting a lot of secrecy. Certainly, a lot of the diplomatic work that has been laid ahead of time to make sure all the allies are on board with sanctions and the sanctions could be rolled out very quickly as they were right away after the invasion. That is something that I think has had an impact. And, it did not obviously deter an invasion, but I don't think anything could have. But it's caused the Russians, I think, to have some serious losses. And it caused what I think has been truly a surprising unified effort to diplomatically and economically isolate Russia to the extent that even I didn't expect, to be honest with you. I didn't think that the Germans and other Europeans would come out as strongly as they did on economic sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, even ahead of us in some ways. They were the first ones to raise the prospect of central bank sanctions before the folks in Washington even were discussing it. So Russia is rapidly on its way to becoming a new North Korea in terms of complete isolation diplomatically and economically. And the longer this war continues, the more brutal the videos and photos that come out of it are, the stronger the sanctions will continue to be as they expand them.
Okay, so again, a lot of things I want to hit there. One is something you mentioned a few questions back, which was that you do expect the Russian army to take Kiev. I do eventually want to get us back there to understand where you think we are in that process, how soon that's going to happen, And then you said it's going to be a very difficult, long campaign after that. I want to try and understand what that means, like what Ukraine is going to look like over the several weeks and months, because that's also going to define the security environment in Eastern Europe. And I think put us in a position to potentially end up in an escalation without necessarily intending to. One question I do have, which is you said you don't think anything could have deterred an invasion. If, and again, I mean, no way suggesting that this would have been prudent, but there are people that have suggested that the Biden administration should have gone so far as to say that they would commit NATO troops in Ukraine should an invasion happen, or threaten to institute a no-fly zone if, in fact, an invasion were to happen. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that they should institute a no-fly zone now. What I'm saying is there are people that are suggesting that having put certain red lines in, that would have deterred Putin. Do you agree with that? Do you think that could have deterred him? What's your response to that?
No, I don't think that it would have deterred him. I think it would have gotten him to be even more radical in his actions, because basically what you're talking about is effectively providing Ukraine with de facto NATO mutual defense guarantees. And that would be absolutely a red line for him. And he would go to war and potentially even use nuclear weapons in response to something like that. So I don't think that was prudent. I'm glad that this wasn't done. And I don't think it's prudent today.
Okay, so let's go back to what you were discussing earlier on, which was Kiev. When do you think, first of all, what does the takeover of Kiev look like, and when do you foresee that happen?
So look, they're going to surround it, as is their doctrine. It's going to take them probably a few more days to pull the rest of the forces from the eastern side over. From the west, they're mostly already there. And then they're going to probably engage in street-by-street fighting. I mean, it's going to be really, really brutal. In fact, if you look at what they did in Grozny almost 20 years ago, they completely destroyed the city when they were taking it over in Chechnya. I think it could be worse in Kiev, because you have mechanized divisions of the Ukrainian military that are entrenched in Kiev. They're going to be contesting every inch. So it's just going to be absolutely horrendous for a city that is many centuries old and is really in many ways a jewel of Eastern Europe, and obviously has a population of 3 million people, many of whom have not been able to get out. I'm in touch with many folks on the ground that are trying to find their way to Lviv and out to Poland. And it's just very, very precarious situation right now. Very tragic. So it's going to be just absolute barbarity, unfortunately, but they have the forces to take it.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, which is what percentage of the civilian population has managed to get out?
Well, total in Ukraine, about 1 million, according to UN estimates. But remember, it's a country of 37 million or so people, so it's a tiny fraction of the overall population.
Are we prepared for the images that are going to come out of Kiev in the days and weeks to come?
Well, I don't know who we is. I certainly
when
expect
I say
them,
we, let me be specific. I'm including myself in this. What we, I mean the majority of Westerners who really have very little knowledge. And I consider myself to have more knowledge than most people. But still, this has taken most of the Western world by surprise. And I think the popular narrative that has been put forward by the Western media is that Ukraine is winning this war. If not winning it in clear terms, winning it in the narrative space and really putting up such a good fight that they are grinding the Russian military into a halt, and that maybe even Russians would become so demoralized by the costs of the war and the fact that they're killing, in many cases, fellow Russians or Russian-speaking people that and that they're invading areas that they vacationed in and visited in, that they simply won't be able to prosecute the war effectively. I think that's the mindset of a lot of people. And so that's the context in which I ask if we're going to be surprised by what we're going to see.
If that's the mindset, then yes, you will absolutely be surprised. So look, there's something to the psychological pressure on the Russian soldiers, at least in the initial days of this invasion. One, they really weren't told that they were going to do it. They learned at the last minute. Two, there was no pretext for why they're invading this country that they consider sort of a brotherly nation. Three, when they're driving down the roads, particularly in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, it looks a lot like Russia. The people speak Russian, they look Russian. If you see an elderly woman on a street, she may very well be your mother or grandmother if you're a Russian soldier that is driving down. So it's psychologically, it is hard to fight in those conditions. However, what has changed now is that the Ukrainians have put up a very strong fight in a number of areas. Russians have suffered significant casualties. And when that happens, people naturally harden, right? When your buddy goes down in front of you or gets seriously wounded, you decide that, whoever is doing that is an animal, and you turn into an animal in response. And you're starting to see a lot of war crimes being committed by Russian troops. And they're now starting to see all Ukrainians as the enemy. So that can change very quickly. And you're starting to see that now. And that's why I think they're going to unleash incredible amounts of brutality on the population, on the Ukrainian military as well. And no, you're right. The West is probably not prepared for it. But that is why I said that Russia is on a path to be North Korea. The sanctions today have not really touched the crown jewels of the Russian economy, its oil and gas sector. It hasn't even touched the majority of the financial sector. 2 out of the top 5 banks have been sanctioned so far. But I fully expect that those sanctions will expand very rapidly once those photos and videos start coming out.
Do you think they'll expand to the oil and gas sector?
Yes.
Can Europe and the United States afford that right now?
Look, I think you have a lot of decisions being made right now based on emotion, based on political pressure from populations that are outraged, rightfully so, by what is going on in Ukraine, by what they're seeing on their television screens. And people are, at this moment in time, I think are going to ignore their economic self-interest because they're seeing so many innocent people dying. When you're seeing schools and kindergartens being shelled, the pictures that are coming out of it are just so horrendous that you're not going to be thinking about the price of gas at that point. And look, we're going to survive. The reality is that prices will go up. They've already gone up substantially, but we have other sources of oil and gas. We have domestic production. Here, Europe is going to be able to get LNG gas from the Middle East. They will pay a lot for it. There may be shortages, but they're going to figure it out. And the reality is that I don't think that we're going to stop at anything at this point in terms of inflicting complete economic devastation on Russia to make them pay for this invasion.
So one of my concerns, and the reason I asked you about whether or not we're prepared for the images, and you made a great point by mentioning the emotional component of this. One of my concerns is that people will increase calls for things like no-fly zones. You've already seen a lot of people call for no-fly zones. I understand when Ukrainians do it, but a lot of folks who aren't Ukrainian are doing that for fear of stating the obvious for people that don't know. A no-fly zone isn't some magic word that you just utter and then the space becomes safe. You have to actually engage NATO has to actually engage Russian aircraft in the air, and that could lead to a really dangerous escalation. Is there a pathway for escalation that comes from further atrocities that become public knowledge in the West?
My guess is no. I know that the Biden administration is focused first and foremost on how do we avoid a war with Russia. I know that they start nearly every meeting with that objective, that no matter what we're going to do and decide today, the objective is let's not get into war with Russia. So I think they're very clearly thinking about this. And that's why you've seen them pressuring the Eastern Europeans in particular that were about to engage in some really reckless activity. There was talk of the Polish and Bulgarian and Slovakian militaries providing aircraft to the Ukrainians, and not only providing aircraft, but letting Ukrainians fly them from Polish bases, essentially making Poland a combatant in this war. Totally disastrous decision. The Russians would absolutely attack those Polish bases, in my view, and then we're in a potential conflict between NATO and Russia. So very quickly, within 24 hours, that decision was reversed and no aircraft will be provided. So I do think that you have people thinking clearly about how do we avoid this escalation. But yes, I've seen a lot of pundits, including people that are very serious, talking about nuclear war as if it's something that you can actually win. I saw one military expert say recently that, yes, we can get into a nuclear conflict, but we should still engage with Russia militarily. I just don't know where these people are coming from because no one wins in a nuclear war scenario.
Wow. So, I have another question here, And actually, I'm going to ask it in two parts, but it's really the second question that I'm most interested in, but the first one kind of sets it up. And the first question is, do you think that if Putin had a crystal ball and he could see up to today how everything turned out, that he would have actually pulled the trigger, one, or that maybe he would have still pulled the trigger, but he would have pulled it later? And then the second question is, what is his logic right now? Like, what do you think the logic is today? And the reason I ask all of that is because I'm trying to assess from you, at least, what you think the extent of his life or death, so to speak, to actually, I think, quote his own speech, interests are in taking control of Ukraine versus how much it was actually a gamble and a gambit because he saw weakness and he thought that he'd be able to do it and get away with it. So that's kind of the overall question, with the end goal of getting to now, given where he's at, given the fact that he cannot go back and change anything, what do you think his objectives are?
So look, on your first question, the hypothetical, obviously it's unknowable. I'm not even sure that he knows if he would do it. I think he is absolutely surprised by the reaction from the West, the strong sanctions that are choking off the Russian economy, and more coming. He probably still thinks that it was worth it. He probably still thinks that those sanctions would have taken place anyway. And I think he's also surprised by the resistance of the Ukrainian population. I think he really delusionally thought that these people did not support the Zelensky government. Zelensky government, of course, was fairly unpopular. His ratings were in the 20s before the invasion, but now he's the hero, not just of the Ukrainians, but really of the whole free world in the valiant defense that he's putting up. I think he's surprised by that for sure. But in terms of his objectives now, I think his objectives, and I'm not sure if he's realized it yet, but his objectives of installing a pro-Russian puppet government have gone out the window. You know, could he put someone in place? Could he go into Kiev, destroy Kiev, kill Zelensky, and install someone like Medvedchuk, one of the pro-Russian oligarchs that he's just actually helped rescue from a suburb of Kiev where he was under house arrest? Could he install him as a president or prime minister? Sure. But you can't really have that person remain in charge without a massive occupation force, an occupation force that probably would come under significant attacks from insurgents. So, if I were him, I would be thinking about an out and how do you compromise and still try to achieve your objectives of not letting Ukraine join NATO, recognizing Crimea as Russian, some sort of demilitarization of Ukraine. I think he could potentially surround Kiev and offer an ultimatum to Zelensky: accept those conditions, you can remain as president and we will leave, or I will decimate Kiev and I will make sure you die. I'm not sure Zelensky would take that deal, though. I think he's now all in as well. And, he's prepared to die, it seems like. So we are unfortunately heading down towards a very, very dark time.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, is it fair to say that for this reason that you just put out, if not for others, Putin is now absolutely committed, if he was not before, absolutely committed to taking control of the entire country, because it gives him, right? I mean, at this point, he's already got the sanctions have been slapped on. Lots of sanctions have already been slapped on. He has become a pariah internationally. He needs something to come to the bargaining table with. Regardless of what it is that he wants, he has to have something to negotiate with. And if he doesn't have control of the country, there's really no starting point. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know. He may be thinking that, but it's going to be really, really hard to run an occupation of this country with the forces that he's got. And he's committed 2/3 of the fighting forces of the Russian military to this operation, but it's probably not enough to run a counterinsurgency, particularly in the West, where the terrain is not conducive to, or is very conducive to insurgencies, because it's much more forestry and mountainous terrain with the Carpathian Mountains down there. So, and the Ukrainians have traditionally staged insurgencies against Russian rules from there, including in the 50s. But I'm not sure if he's realizing that yet. He may still be thinking that this is going to go pretty well. And we'll see. Now they're occupying cities, particularly in the south, like Kherson and others, Melitopol, and they're trying to establish Russian rule, Russian military rule. They're handing out flyers telling people, don't believe Ukrainian propaganda. We're not fighting you. We're fighting the so-called junta in Kiev. And they're also promoting their Telegram channels as a source of information that they can believe. we'll see if that works. I'm very dubious. I think they have turned the Ukrainian population completely anti-Russian with their brutality. When you look at the pictures that are coming out, even in the very northern Western cities that are right on the border with Russia, people are shouting at the Russian soldiers as they're going through. They're saying they're occupiers, they're scum of the earth. So, and they're saying this in Russian. So you have people that may have had affinity in the past towards Russia. Much of that is now gone because of the brutality that they're inflicting on the population right now. But it's unknowable if he realizes that or not. I'll tell you this. I've always believed that Putin is a gambler. He's been a very lucky gambler. But when you look at what he has done over the last 22 years of his rule, going to Chechnya just 3 years after brutal defeat of the Russian forces in the first Chechen war that ended in 1996 with their just disastrous pullout that almost took down the Yeltsin government. 3 years later, he goes back in and achieves obviously a remarkable success through sheer brutality. He uses radioactive weapons in the center of London to kill a dissident, Litvinenko. There was a critic of Putin's. He uses chemical weapons for assassinations in the UK and even in Europe, continental Europe. He goes into Syria on an adventure that many people thought would be a quagmire for him and would result in lots of losses. All of those things were gambles. They proved to be successful gambles. He came out of most of them unscathed, but he's a gambler nevertheless. And he's gambled everything on this conflict with Ukraine. And particularly, he has gambled Russia. Because what's going to happen in Russia, I think, is going to be the most interesting part in this historical episode. Whatever happens in Ukraine, there is no going back to how Russia was 3 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, and so forth. It is now fully a dictatorship. The draconian crackdowns that you have seen in the last few days are really something else. He has shut down all independent media in Russia. He's been shutting it down consistently since he's come to power, but he left a few outlets, one TV station, TV Rain, Echo of Moscow radio station, Novaya Gazeta newspaper, sort of as a token to show the West that, no, we still have opposition views here, not viewed or listened by many, but we have it somewhere. Well, now there's zero tolerance for that. He's shut all of them down now permanently. He has just signed a law that the Duma passed yesterday that has jail terms for anyone that is even advocating for anti-war protests, much less going to a protest. Just calling for protests can now get you in jail for several years. Any publication of material that is negative towards the Russian military can land you up to 15 years in jail. So you're now seeing all the Western journalists basically pull out of Russia because they're in danger of being imprisoned just for publishing the news about how the campaign is going in Ukraine. Just utter authoritarianism that is being unleashed to the extent that he really, up to this point, has not done. And there's no going back from that. You are now squarely on the path towards Stalinism. We're not yet at the Stalin level of brutality, but we're on a path there if he continues. And Russia will be forever changed from this.
All right. So that actually raises two kind of major topic categories that I do want to discuss with you. One is the internal dynamics, both political dynamics of the population and popular support, as well as the dynamics within his own circle of advisors and sources of power in Ukraine. And that speaks to in Russia. And that speaks directly to the question of, could there be a coup of Putin? Is there some way to depose him which does not lead to the worst case scenarios? That's one category. Before we get to that, though, I want to actually stay with this conversation about escalation and peace and off-ramps. First of all, it seems, and I'm curious to understand this because I haven't really seen anyone comment on it. I've seen some suggestions that Putin may be unvaccinated and he's concerned about getting COVID, and this is the reason why he holds these very weird, long table conversations with his advisors. I'm curious to know if you have any insights on that. But the larger observation is that he probably, like many megalomaniacs of his generation, of his age, has an extremely pathological fear of death. And so that kind of brings me to a number of questions. One question, but three parts. What do you think motivates him, or rather, what's important to him, rather. If we're going to talk about a peace deal, if we're talking about de-escalation, we have to understand what is important to him. What does he value the most? So what's most important to Putin? And then what's really important to Zelensky and the leadership in Ukraine? What's non-negotiable for them? And then similarly, what are those things for the European-US alliance?
Great question. So first of all, I have heard a rumor that he's unvaccinated. Impossible to prove it now, but he's clearly very afraid of COVID. Anyone that goes to see him has to quarantine for 2 weeks if they're going to be at all close to him, in complete isolation, or else they're going to be 30 feet away across these ridiculously long tables. So that is absolutely the reality. In terms of what's important to him, look, he has amassed enormous personal wealth that he can never spend in his own lifetime. So he's already checked that box of making sure that he's personally enriched and his family will be very well off no matter what happens. But I think now he's looking for historical greatness. He actually does not compare himself to Soviet leaders. In fact, he has criticized pretty much every Soviet leader except Andropov and Chernenko, who ruled the Soviet Union for just a few years in the early 80s. But every single other leader, from Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, certainly Gorbachev, he has criticized viciously. In fact, when he did this bizarre speech to announce the invasion, he basically tore into Lenin for, in his words, creating Ukraine out of thin air. Completely false, by the way. But he's accusing Lenin essentially of causing the situation that he finds himself in right now. So out of the 69 years that the Soviet Union has been in power, he's criticized the leaders that have led it for 67 out of those 69 years. So he's certainly not trying to recreate the Soviet Union, but he does look fondly on the old Russian Empire that preceded it. And in many ways, he's acting like the new czar. This war was his and his alone. He was the ultimate decision maker. That is not the way that the decisions were made in the old Soviet Union days. Yes, you had the head of the party like a Brezhnev or Khrushchev, but they had to get consensus on the Politburo. There were true debates in this very tiny circle of people that were running the country, but it was not sort of a one-man dictatorship. It was that way under Stalin, but not afterwards. And he's really going back to the Tsarist era, comparing himself to Peter the Great, that is trying to recreate the old Russian Empire, the old Russian sphere of influence. And that's why Ukraine is so important to him, because it's been part of Russia in those days and a critical part of Russia.
Well, just one quick note there before you continue, Dmitry. I have a question because I recall leading up to the invasion, there was some video footage of him speaking to his advisors, and I think it was the head of intelligence who was trying to kind of push back a little bit. And, it looked, for lack, I wish I could think of a better way to put it. It looked like he was pissing his pants. He was so afraid of upsetting Putin that he, in real time, rephrased what he had to say to clearly something that he hadn't intended to say, but which basically simply validated and agreed with what Putin's position was.
So that was a really interesting episode. So this was the head of the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Agency, Sergei Naryshkin, who, by the way, is an old friend of Putin's. They actually were roommates together in the KGB dormitories back in the 70s. So they've known each other for a very, very long time. But he seemed completely unprepared for this show Security Council that we witnessed on that Monday before the invasion. And he was mumbling, and Putin started cutting him off and saying, "Speak clearly. What are you trying to say?" And then Naryshkin said something that was not on the agenda at all, because the topic was, should we recognize these statelets in Donbass as independent? And Naryshkin said, we should recognize them as being part of Russia. And Putin very angrily said, wait a second, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about annexations. We're talking about independence. And Naryshkin then immediately corrected himself and says, well, then, yes, that I'm in favor of independence.
But he also said, if I'm not mistaken, he said that we should give the Americans or NATO one more chance. Didn't he say something like that? And Putin really cut him off. He was not happy about that.
There were a few people, Lavrov in particular, the foreign minister, I think Naryshkin, and some others that have raised this issue of, before we recognize, maybe we should engage in one more element of diplomacy, which again shows you how close hold that decision was, that even these advisors that, part of the cabinet effectively of Russia did not really know what Putin was planning. And, that he had already made the decision that recognition of these independent states was just a path to invasion, which he initiated a few days later. But it was very clear in retrospect that they had no idea that he was going to do it. And what I'm hearing from people elsewhere that they were completely shocked that very few people expected him to actually invade. A lot of them in Moscow thought that he was bluffing. It turns out that he wasn't.
Yeah, I'm somewhat fascinated to understand how it is that one man can wield so much power. What are the lines of communication and oversight of the Russian military and the state that he has that he can actually do that? I mean, that's not necessarily a question. It's me thinking aloud. Feel free to answer it. But I also want to make sure that I put you back on track because my question was what's important to Putin? And again, I asked the same thing of Ukraine's leadership and the US European NATO alliance. The reason that I was asking and what I meant by important for all of these folks is right here in the here and now, what is important in terms of what would be non-negotiable, what needs to be on the table in order for us to reach a peace deal, in order to understand whether some of these things are mutually exclusive, and we really can't get there anytime soon until something structural changes as a result of a long period of war.
Look, ironically, I think it's easier to read Putin than it is to read Zelensky right now. Obviously, the man is under incredible pressure, physical, psychological, etc. He's had some successes. He's been able to stand up to the mighty Russian army for over a week now and inflicted some serious pains on them. And he has seen the international community mobilize behind him like it hasn't done in many decades. And he's become a hero to so many around the world. That obviously, pumps you with a ton of adrenaline, makes you more defiant, makes you want to continue fighting. So I'm not sure if he is looking at the situation realistically and the reality that NATO is not going to institute a no-fly zone, that NATO troops are not coming to help, and that he does not have the forces to really hold off the Russians and prevent just utter decimation of his country. So I'm not sure that he is actually willing to make a deal that would be incredibly painful and incredibly precarious for him politically. As I mentioned, there's probably a deal to be had if you give up Crimea, recognize it as Russian. It's never going back to Ukraine anyway. Everyone knows that. If you give up forever the idea of joining NATO and the EU and establish some sort of neutrality in terms of weapons infrastructure in Ukraine, there's probably a deal to be had with Putin, given that he has suffered significant casualties already and he's turned the population against him. So he might realize that his broader objective of turning Ukraine into a pro-Russian state is not achievable. But I just don't think that anyone in Ukraine would take that deal right now. So I don't think that a compromise is doable.
And what about, okay, there is a level of strong arming that can happen here on the part of NATO. They can influence some level of pressure on Zelensky because obviously he's, to your point, hoping for a no-fly zone. He's hoping for some type of support. His calculations would be very different if he felt that he was entirely alone. Is there any level of pressure that the Americans and the Europeans can apply to him to try and make him a bit more flexible on his end? Or is the divide here just too great?
No one is going to do that. Look, this is a man that is fighting for his country, fighting for his country's independence under horrible conditions where the other side is committing numerous war crimes. No one, not the Europeans, not the Americans, are going to apply pressure on him to make concessions to Russia in this situation. I don't think that's in the cards at all.
Okay, so Dmitry, I'm going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. I do want to try and understand better, if a peaceful resolution is unlikely at this stage, what does that mean for the future of Ukraine? And what does that look like for conditions in that country going forward? And I think that also opens up a conversation about both Russian domestic politics and public opinion in the face of what could become a chronic insurgency in Ukraine, as well as scenarios in which Putin could theoretically be removed from power, the so-called palace coup scenarios. I also want to expand our conversation to think about the knock-on implications of what we talked about so far for the broader multipolar order. How, for example, do you think this will impact Russian-Sino relations, U.S.-China relations, Chinese risk-reward calculations over any plans to retake Taiwan, as well as European security, and whether the outbreak of war on the continent is actually bullish for the future of the European Union, a point that I've tried to make in previous episodes. Also, just to get this out there, I definitely want to take advantage of your knowledge and experience in cybersecurity, because I really do worry that once Putin gets a handle on the situation in Ukraine, he will look to retaliate against the US and Europe for the sanctions that they put on him by targeting our payments infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and whatever else he feels justified to attack. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Dmitry, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Dmitry, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation onto the premium feed. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.